you're recruiting a rescuer who knows more about what's going on in your own self, in your own body than you do. And the challenge is that the villain is also you, right? So you're actually fighting your own self, your own body, your own symptoms. And that fragmentation is a reflection of this inner fragmentation. So whenever we are in that position of imagining that something outside of us has power over us and that we are at the mercy of an unwanted influence, maybe not always, but it seems to me most of the time, it's a projection, right? It's a projection of that dimension of ourselves on the outside. It's like we're playing this game so we get to know ourselves on the outside. And, I began to see, wow, like this is relevant not only for health, but it's relevant in all of the dynamics that influence our health.
Welcome to Far Out with Faust, everybody. I am Faust Chicho, and today I am excited and honored to be joined by none other than Kelly Brogan, MD. You've probably heard of her. She's a holistic psychiatrist. She's author of the New York Times bestselling book, A Mind of Your Own, Own Yourself. She's author of the children's book, A Time for Rain, and co-editor of the landmark textbook, Integrative Therapies for Depression. She's the founder of the online healing program, Vital Mind Reset, and the membership community Vital Life Project. She completed her psychiatric training and fellowship at NYU Medical Center after graduating from Cornell University Medical College. She has a BS from MIT in systems neuroscience. She is specialized in root cause resolutions approach to psychiatric syndromes and symptoms. Kelly, thank you so much for beaming in. It's an honor to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I first saw Kelly way back. This is crazy. And there was a documentary that came out in 2015, produced by none other than Facebook, if you can believe this. This is obviously a long time ago, before a lot of these media companies were co-opted and activated as the intelligence agencies, gathering information and censoring as they have become. But they made this little gem of a documentary called Bought. Right. And I can't recommend this enough. If you can find this documentary, it's one of the first that came out like that in this kind of new era we're in. And that was the first time I laid eyes on this woman. And I was like, wow, what an incredible, what courage to be speaking the way you were. That was a while ago. A lot has happened since that. Obviously, Facebook, aka Meta, has stopped making documentaries which act as expose for the pharmaceutical industry. My God. But that was the first time that I was like, my God, who is this woman? So it's crazy that all these years later, now I'm sitting here and going to be talking to you. Very cool.
I love it. How did you like my blowout in the movie? That was back in the day where I would get like a blowout every 3 days in New York.
I loved it. I was living in New York at the time, so I thought it was great.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, no, that was Jeff Hayes. That was that was in my righteous, angry bitch phase. So it was like very much in line with, the mission and the message that I was dedicated to at that time, and still am, just in a different approach, I guess.
Well, you had a righteous right to be angry. So I don't blame you, at least you got a chance to express it in a way like that.
Yes.
So you've had an incredible personal and professional journey, Kelly. And for some of my listeners who may not be familiar with your story, do you think you could give us a kind of a brief walkthrough of how you went from this, incredibly degreed and trained psychiatrist, who's got a specialization in neuroscience, and to becoming kind of a health and wellness revolutionary and being right on the forefront of everything?
Yeah, I always marvel at how this little intro story evolves over time, because I think I get bored of my own narrative at a certain point, and then I tried to simplify it even more. But I was a total normie, and I was very much a devotee to the Church of Scientism. I was like a card-carrying cult member in the allopathic institution, and I went to medical school to become specifically a psychiatrist. And I did that because I worked a suicide hotline at MIT, and I developed a relationship to human suffering, including my own, that was predicated on this idea that we can mitigate it. We can even like totally suppress it if we just get psychiatrists involved, right? So people would call this hotline, and my role, in addition to, I guess supporting them in the moment, would be to connect them to the student mental health center. And the psychiatrists would fix everything, right? Fix all of their struggles and their, inner conflicts, and hopefully save their lives. And of course, I wasn't aware of this consciously at the time, but I also developed a relationship to my own discomfort about human suffering, which was very fix-it oriented, right? So I'm very interested in masculine, feminine polarity conversations. And so these days I think of that as like my very immature masculine, right? Like that adolescent dude in me who's got to just like quick fix it. This sucks. Yeah, exactly. Right. Like no ability to just rest into the knowing that he can guide from a different place. No. So I just needed to fix it, make it go away. And so psychiatry seemed like this very empowering place to invest my time and energy and blood, sweat, tears, $200,000 of debt and all the rest of it. And that's, what I did for my training. My fellowship was, I was so into this that my fellowship was in prescribing to pregnant and breastfeeding women. Wow. So you have to be a real zealot to believe that your role is to bring these pharmaceutical products to the most vulnerable populations, on this plane. And that's what I did. I was one of the first 300 to specialize in that particular niche, because there was a growing population of reproductive age women. At the time, it was like 1 in 4. I imagine it's more now, who were entering into pregnancy or considering pregnancy or already pregnant and medicated, right? So there was this crisis of informed consent. And my specialization was to help women essentially feel better, or at least more informed about their decision to continue medications during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And I learned a bit about the literature at that point, and how you could really interpret the medical literature through many, many different lenses. And that has served me. There's a lot that I took from that time window. There's a lot that I took from my training in general that has served my capacity to see through, the headline, that we might be delivered about science, quote unquote.
The sales pitch.
And yeah, the sales pitch that's, a convenient marketing strategy, honestly, for whatever agenda might be on the table. And it wasn't until shortly after my fellowship, I was pregnant at that time as well, that I was diagnosed with my first health condition, right? So a lot of doctors who go rogue do so because of their own personal experience, right? So when they have an experience of the limitations of the system that they had participated in supporting, then there is this rupture, right? Sometimes it's called a rupture of empathy, right? This sense that the system they devoted themselves to actually isn't available to serve them in the way that they would hope. And so when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis, I knew there was no way out through this system. And I was totally unwilling to take a prescription for the rest of my life, ironically, right? It's like, fine for my patients, but not for me. I'm not going to CVS every month. And so I was led down a different fork in the road, and I saw a naturopath. I made very basic dietary changes and took a bunch of supplements, and I watched, on paper, my condition, which could have been chronic and recidivistic, resolve in the space of a year. And you would think that would have made me, like so inspired and so excited. Except, as I referenced earlier, I took my sword out of its sheath and I raised it aloft and ripped my clothes off and ran onto the battlefield. Like it just activated that. Now, of course, through the lens I work in these days, the cardinal wound.
Mm.
I actually think it was the mother wound, right? So this mother who was there to nurture me, right? Medicine, mommy medicine, there to nurture me, has betrayed me and violated me. And, I will exact revenge. So I published a book with an exploding pill on the cover. And I spent a lot of years very angry, righteous, up at night, sort of lamenting that I had brought children into this world
Mm.
because of how, messed up it is. And it wasn't until I met my mentor, Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez, that I had a shift into my heart, really, and he
Mm.
was like a very benevolent, magical father figure for me. And I found inspiration again. And I recognized that what I was doing, which at that point also began to include a lot of vaccine activism and advocacy around informed choice. It was really dark. It was
Yeah.
really dark. And the people that I was on the front lines with were pretty miserable folks, right?
Mm.
Like angry, bitter, blaming, like really entrenched in what I would now refer to as victim consciousness.
Mm.
And, that's how I look at it now. It's like in this psycho maturational journey, right? Like you go from compliance and idealization and like, oh, the system's got me and there's nothing to see here. And then there's this rupture, right? And then most of us flip to the other side in
Yeah.
defiance, right? And we become angry, finger pointing, blaming. We're still just as disempowered. It's just from the other, sort of attached
Mm-hmm.
side of the coin. And so it wouldn't be until actually my mentor's sudden death that I would go through yet another dark night of the soul and make contact with the sovereign impulse behind my work, which is to experience, the vitality that is the human birthright
Mm-hmm.
through each of the people that I touch. And I began publishing with a team of volunteers all of these case reports and case series. We actually did an IRB approved, amazingly, randomized trial of these outcomes that are dogma defying, like that shouldn't exist, right? So, like putting 18 years of lupus into remission in 5 weeks, or
Mm.
resolving Graves' disease without any surgical or pharmaceutical intervention. And it was almost like a fun sport for me for a period of time to just sort of see what I could get onto the pages of the peer-reviewed medical literature, and it felt good. And so I started to go to bed at night feeling inspired instead of,
Yeah.
drained and depleted. And that is really what I think started to give way to my dedication to this concept of victim consciousness, smoking it out, identifying how, each of us participate in our own disempowerment. We shirk our power of choice, and we actually get our needs met through our own suffering. And so I've become interested over the past couple of years in the way that these dynamics show up in relationship to systems, to community, to our partners, to our families, to our children, and to really help myself and potentially facilitate, this awareness in others to take responsibility and to recognize, that access to our creative power has several gates, all of which we have the keys to.
Absolutely. We sure do. What a journey. My God. I and now I want to find that study that you made, and that would be something that I would enjoy reading.
I'll share it with you. Yeah.
That
No,
would be
and that was
great.
just like the PG version of the story.
I'm sure it was. That's incredible. I feel like it's always all roads lead back to Rome, and Rome I think is the heart. I think if you're going to find your way in this life, you have to come into your heart space, and then things become a lot clearer and easier at the same time, to the extent that they can become easier in this life on this planet right now.
Yeah.
But that's amazing to hear. Very, very, very cool. I your book. A Mind of Your Own, the truth about depression and how women can heal their bodies to reclaim their lives, caused, as you know, an absolute firestorm. um, and now, of course, the medical establishment is catching up, and mainstream media has had to admit that, we were sold complete fabrications and fraud science about antidepressants. I mean, it was a sales pitch. It was a myth, but you were kind of put through the ringer at the time for not towing the allopathic line. And they haven't obviously quit trying to put people like you through the ringer, who are continuing to try to speak the truth, which becomes obviously, it's a giant river, and we're trying to stem the flow, and it's difficult, but they take notice when people do. And so I'm just wondering how that was for you, and how it is now, and seeing the literature and the science catch up with what you've been saying for many years. How does that feel?
So I wrote that book that you referenced, A Mind of Your Own, and there's hundreds of references in it, and most of them are with the intent of not only exposing the truth about the lack of efficacy and the adverse effects and the specifically long-term dependency issues that come with these medications, but also to evidence the natural healing path, right? So the
Yeah.
power of lifestyle change. And this is not just like some window dressing like I learned in medical school when I had a half an hour of nutrition lecture, right, over 4 years. It's not just sort of like, oh yeah, and by the way, like don't drink like a big gulp soda every day. It's not that, right? So this
Yeah.
is actual confirmation and affirmation of the fact that our bodies want to heal. And when you create the conditions for your body to do so, that will spontaneously happen, which is why I have one protocol. It is one template. And I have all these outcomes in all of these different chronic illnesses, none of which are my medical specialty, aside from the psychiatric outcomes. So why would that ever happen? Other than that, you can create the conditions to send this signal of safety to the nervous system, specifically what's called the autonomic nervous system, and then the body resets, right? And it does so irrepressibly, right? So I became pretty convinced that I would publish this book and nobody would ever touch a medication again, right? And then I would go and like lecture internationally and have people all over come up to me and be like, oh my God, I loved your book. It was so great. And I just like, I just had to start Lexapro. I just like didn't have a choice. And so that's why I think, my interest was piqued in what is the anatomy of this disempowerment? Because this is not about information. I mean, certainly over the past 3 years, I'm sure you have this experience too. There are so many examples of trying to provide somebody information and recognizing it's not about that, right?
Yeah.
It's not the lack of information that is driving the decisions that people make to comply with, the lowest hanging conventional fruit. And so what does go into that? And so, when I interested myself in that, I began to learn, that you're a match to the system, that you frequent, right? So I was a match absolutely to the allopathic system when I was a part of it. My belief field, the framework of my, mindset was one of this, like, again, like shirking of responsibility, this sense of a rescuer must be out there. And when you enter into this triangle, which is comprised, the Cartman triangle is comprised of the villain, the victim, and the rescuer, you often don't know which angle you're occupying, but they all have the same consciousness driving the decision making and the orientation towards the problem, right? So it's fear driven and control based. So whenever we imagine that it's somebody else's fault, now the problem with this triangle as it applies to allopathic medicine is that it's really you and the victim, right? So why me? No fair. Can't believe this is happening. I hate this, right? And you're recruiting the rescuer, which is the system. By the way, this can also apply to the greenwashed version in holistic and integrative and functional
Sure.
medicine, where you're in that same mentality of like, I hate what's happening. My body has betrayed me. Let me take 12,000 supplements instead of, 100
Yeah.
meds. But regardless, you're recruiting a rescuer who knows more about what's going on in your own self, in your own body than you do. And the challenge is that the villain is also you.
Hmm.
Right. So you're actually fighting your own self, your own body, your own symptoms. And that fragmentation is a reflection of this inner fragmentation. So whenever we are in that position of imagining that something outside of us has power over us and that we are at the mercy of an unwanted influence, it's maybe not always, but it seems to me most of the time it's a projection, right? It's a projection
Hmm.
of that dimension of ourselves on the outside. It's like we're playing this game so we get to know ourselves on the outside. And I began to see, wow, like this is relevant not only for health, but it's relevant in all of the dynamics that influence our health, right? So that primary partnership, right? So how is it that your codependency and your romantic relationship and you're imagining that you need to suppress and deny your own needs in service of somebody else's so that you can secure the safety that you imagine is not otherwise available to you? Like, how is that actually influencing how your system is functioning on a daily basis? That's influencing your experience of symptoms. How is your body speaking to you about you through your symptoms, trying to invite you to reorient, right, to different dimensions of overwhelm and stress in your lifescape? So the evolution of my perspective also tracked with my own growth and spiritual maturation that is certainly still ongoing, where I recognized like this fight, right, against the system, right, that energy that I embodied and bought, it plays a role for sure, and I think it's great that there are still people out there, whose entire feeds are comprised of the latest, details on the latest psyops. For me, I felt like in 2020, the most important contribution I could make after I spent like 6 months obsessing about what was going on and like, running my mouth on it and whatever, I got to this place where I was like, oh shit, this is an inside job, right?
Yeah.
So like, how am I in this moment embodying the traits that I am fighting against? Okay, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, control-based dynamics. And I made a lot of changes in my personal life, as did so many of us,
Hmm.
right? So from mundane things like re-recording all the videos in Vital Mind Reset, my program, so that I could come with a different energy that was less of like a scary, punishing father, which is
Yeah.
sort of the energy that I embodied in my practice, honestly. All the way to, I never told my girls again, my daughters again, like to finish their plates or try the thing or clean their rooms, right? Like anywhere where I was imagining I knew better how somebody should be than they know,
Yeah.
right? Anytime I imagine that I'm the expert of somebody's experience more so than they are. And anytime I found myself in what I now call the erotic caress of the enemy, right? Like obsessing out there instead of growing my capacity to be with that discomfort. Remember that I knew I wasn't able to be with back in college when I was working that hotline.
Mm.
So growing the capacity to hold uncomfortable feelings, fear, shame, grief, rage in my system, honestly, for like 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds at a time. And to this day, I work on this, right? Where
Yeah.
I'll get an email that I hate that triggers my somatic sequence, and I have like a rush of energy at my chest, and I'm like hot under my arms and up my neck and whatever. And I send the email, the scathing email reply.
Backspace, backspace, backspace. Yeah.
Oh no, I send it, right? But like, instead of choosing myself, right? Like instead of choosing to be with whatever this fortuitous circumstance of this email has brought out in me, that's already mine. They didn't do it to me, right? And I have this opportunity now to develop intimacy with the part of me that, you know, has probably been neglected for decades
Mm.
because I've been engaged in the defensive loop of trying not to feel the feeling. So, these days in my membership, Vital Life Project, and in whatever it is that I'm blabbing about anywhere, I'm mostly focused on what it is to take every single opportunity, I call it, to enter through the upset, and to really make a laboratory out of your life, out of your challenges, out of your adversity, and to really not take the bait of victim consciousness, right? Like,
Mm.
what is it to not take the bait of blaming, finger pointing, and condemning, right? So, like, what is it to exercise your power of choice without needing what it is that you are not choosing to
Yeah.
be bad and wrong, right? Like, how can you choose to leave your partner without making the case for what an asshole they are, right? Like,
Yeah.
how can you choose to not participate in the allopathic system without needing an entire blog dedicated to how evil it is, right? Like, how can you opt out
A
of the
series of
financial
videos.
system? Yeah, exactly. The educational system, like, how can you just say, like, wow, that's not for me now that I see it's not for me? Versus like, this is terrible and horrible.
Yeah.
Like, I did that for many, many, many years. And again, it's not right or wrong. It's just, for me, that was ultimately
Yeah.
disempowering, and ultimately like such an energy leak. And every single time I encounter this experience of being misunderstood or mischaracterized, or that rupture of empathy where a system I dedicated myself to now exposes itself to be less than interested in my well-being, right? It's all an opportunity to align more with that sovereign impulse, right? That power to blaze my own trail, and to non-referentially, non-oppositionally orient towards like that which I imagine is aggressing me, attacking me, making my life like difficult and horrible. So I'm super interested in this opportunity we all have to work towards the transformation of victim consciousness and the remembrance of our inborn power. I mean, that has to be part of why we incarnated. It's like
Hmm.
for the delight of remembering that, right? Like, it's like, um, I think there's a Greek word, anamnesia. It's like you knew it,
Right.
and now you're coming out of the not knowing of it, right?
Yeah.
It's like this funny hide and seek,
It's like a
that we
deja
play.
vu almost.
Exactly. I like that. Yeah, exactly.
I love that about you, Kelly. I love that's what you're bringing forth, because I mean, it's clear to me everywhere I look how much we need it as a planet. And there aren't a lot of, I mean, there are a lot of people in their own way, but you very specifically um, have a very empowering message. And I was just speaking to a friend who put themselves on Prozac, um, and I was like, why did you? And I know she's been having some difficulty, but I was like, you've self prescribed, you've went out and she doesn't live in America, and got this, and I was like trying to encourage her before, because it's only been 2 weeks, that
Mm.
maybe this is not the route that would be best for her, considering where she lives and what she has access to, and it's difficult when you're trying to empower people, and get them to have a greater perspective of what they're doing, usually habitually, and the options that they have, the choice that they have. It's tough because you gotta be familiar with the subconscious. You gotta
Mhm.
begin to understand how you operate. I was an actor for 22 years, and you start to learn about pub when you're playing a character, you learn about the public persona of the character. And then you learn about their fatal flaw as well. And the really crafty actors understand that you need to know both about that character you're playing. You can't just know one or the other. You don't have a true three-dimensional, living, breathing person, because we all kind of operate with these things. And it's like subconscious, subconscious, subconscious. Now, I'm much happier doing what I'm doing. You know, considering I was like, I was telling my kids the other day, I was like, listen, I used to fake sick to get out of school. And by the end of the day, I was fully symptomatic. Okay. Like this is, you know, I'm like, so I went into acting. It was a natural course for me, and I was very good at it. But knowing what I know now, I'm so much happier doing what I'm doing because I just know about our ability to manifest our beliefs, and I saw, like, Christopher Reeves. I mean, not a lot of people know this, but the role he played right before he had that accident was a paraplegic, and he prepared for 8 months almost, just living the life of a paraplegic. And it was his worst fear, this role that he took on. Became so obsessed with it. And what happened after he got done shooting it? We all know what happened, but after he was riding a horse and became a paraplegic. But I'm just like, yeah, I think I moved out of that phase of my life. I don't want to. It's just scary to me, because I know how powerful we are. Our beliefs are, especially when it
Yeah.
comes to the body and to reality, bringing
Yeah.
things. So anyway, that was just a little rant.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah, no, I mean the vector, right, of attention it's like one of the primary things we have control over. And it's it is challenging to recognize when we are distracting ourselves, like when we are misusing that
mm,
power, we are relinquishing it, maybe even. And one of the ways I have found is actually in that little story you told about your friend is so, I mean, we work on this in my community all the time because, we're all sort of like truthers and,
hmm,
freedom fighters and whatever. And
yeah,
the shadow of that has been something that's really interested me, right? Because like take that example, right? So your friend, I don't know the details obviously, but she started on this med, and inside yourself you feel something, right? And that feeling is not good, right?
right,
So you're like, ooh, I don't like that she's doing that. It feels bad in my system. I'm worried about her. She could become one of those statistics who, like
mm,
kills her kid because she develops, akathisia or whatever 3 weeks in, and she could be somebody who's on it for like 5 years and then she can't get off. She could be somebody who
yeah,
ends up on like 10 meds because she's entered into the hamster wheel, and I could lose connection with this person and she could become almost like feel like a walk-in or something, right?
hmm,
So all this is going inside of you, and you're feeling like, I don't want this. This does not work for me, but for you, right?
yeah,
And so instead of, and not to like put you on the spot because we do this every day, but like instead of like being with that, like, oh, okay, like, what is that feeling inside me? Like, okay, like I feel this like tightness in my chest, and like, what is like this tightness trying to tell me? It's like, my responsibility, right? Like it's my
mm,
responsibility to make sure people are okay, right? Well, where did you get that idea from? Right? And you track it back to like when you were 5, and you develop this notion that you are the parentified child whose job it is to make sure your parents are fucking cool, right?
yeah,
Like otherwise, like it's threatening for you to live in the world. Like your existential needs are on the line, and you develop these strategies, right? So you're focused outside on her. So you're using that vector of attention, but not inward on her. And what
mm,
I found is that my shadow, which means like, of course, I'm sure people know, right? Like the dimensions of myself that I don't have intimacy with, and that
mm,
I imagine maybe I don't even have inside of myself. So my shadow often declares itself subtly through this one phrase, right? Which is like, I'm going to get him or her to see.
mm,
And imagine I've made a career out of this. I'm going to get you to see. I'm going to convince you. And I probably developed rhetorical skills to argue my case, to create like this, bulleted, document every time I have an opinion on all of the reasons why I'm right.
yeah,
And I deliver that, at the grocery store to my kids, like to my gardener, and let alone like, in an
the
interview or
mailman, yeah,
exactly,
yeah,
right? So anytime I feel I don't like, right, which means I'm different from whomever is in front of me in a way that has charge, in a way that I'm judging, really, right? Like, let's be clear about it. I am going, my shadow is going to be activated. It's going to say, you're unsafe here. Start acting, start defending yourself. no need to look deeper into this. No need to see that maybe I have a lot in common with this person I'm judging, right? And I might do the exact same freaking thing if I was in her shoes. Rather not look into that. So how about I just preserve my self-concept? And in order to do that, I need her to be wrong and I need to be right. So I'm going to go out onto that field of her lifescape and I'm going to get her to see.
Yeah.
The reason that is an act of aggression, I have come to realize, especially as an activist, right, who does this for a living, right, is that it's not about the other person, and it appears to be, right, like it appears to be an offer, but what's actually happening is you're asking for someone to see your perspective. You want that, right? And I'm not saying any of this is true for you, but it would be for me in your shoes, where I would feel like, if I were really honest, if the truth was like, you know, in a caption underneath, it would say, I don't like the feeling that I have in my body when you tell me how you're living your life. I really want you to change so that I feel better. Will you read this book?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, would you
I'll
actually
send it to
say
you.
that?
What's your address?
Right, exactly. You would never say that shit, because once we expose our true intentions, our true motives, even to our own awareness, it changes our behavior. And it's only when it's lived in the occult, right? When it's shrouded, when it's hidden from our own awareness, let alone other, our you know, willingness to own that in another's eyes, that another person feels it. They feel it in their animal body. And that's why, you know, anyone who's ever received like a you know, like a Telegram update or a blog or whatever newsletter from an activist has this feeling of like, I need to share this.
Yeah.
Right. But what is that about? I mean, I spent years in this realm, like getting information all activated about it, and I got to share it. Right. But what's actually happening there is not the philanthropic, altruistic, like I must help humanity see the truth, otherwise they're in peril. I think actually the bigger drive is that I feel so much discomfort in my own body, and I'm going to discharge it in this way, and I'm going to induce it in somebody else so that we connect through, so I find some security and safety through the shared misery. That's what commiseration is, right? So I'm super interested in this shadow side of activism, doing good for the world, making the world a better place, helping people see, because I've lived it. I probably still live it. I have a really hard time. You know, I don't know a single person literally in my lifescape who's been jabbed, you know, in the past 3 years. That's how insulated my world is. That's how much I need, you know, to not feel the feelings that would come up if I were to, you know, let's say take a highly medicated lover or something, right? Like I just can't handle that, right? So it's not a virtuous thing. It's like literally something I would have to integrate, you know, many dimensions of myself that I would project on that person in judgment before I would ever be able to live, you know, so sovereignly, like in company that is so mixed. So it's a complex topic, but I think if we focus on this level of one-on-one interactions with people who trigger us, right? People who are living in a way that we don't like, we will eventually identify the way that we can be ourselves. So have a strong spine and also have this soft heart, like be ourselves, be individuated through, you know, the pillar of our self concept, and then connect still. And it does not mean you approve. It does not mean you are giving anything, right? You're offering anything necessarily. It just means that you're not in active rejection. And, you know, that which we are in active rejection of, we are in intimate dynamic. I would even argue erotic dynamic, because the energies of it are vitalized by like a certain kind of life force that is way more than just awareness. It's embodied. It's a sense that, you know, you feel it in your body when you fucking hate something, right? Like that's not just sort of like a fleeting thought. So, you know, it's almost like I really love Carolyn Elliott's work. She wrote Existential Kink, and she talks about how we get off on the things that we hate about our lives and other people, right? Like it's actually erotic for us, and it's sort of like the
It's
best we
habitual
think is
too and
available.
addicting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's addictive. Exactly.
Yeah. But so my question then for you about what you said is, what is the feeling then? Because the feeling is obviously nuanced, and it changes depending on what you're hearing and who you're hearing it from and in what setting and context. You know, like I've come to trust my intuition, but of course my intuition is usually accompanied by a feeling.
Yeah.
um, and that feeling can vary depending on what I'm hearing. And I often I trust the response I'm having. A lot of times because of the feedback that I get after I give it, or what I find out later on. So my question is, if and I'm sure that this is a question that you've come up against and have spent a lot of time with, but if you know that you have experience in the situation that is happening, and someone tells you something or comes to you and says something, and immediately you have, from your experience, and you want to share what you have learned about the situation, um, and your motivation for doing that is in part because you see this person going down a path which you have already been down and fallen into many of the pitfalls that are laid on that path. And I know, and this is, the more I speak this thought out, the more I see that there's futility in it. But at the same time, I also see that there are some people who maybe are ready to hear, and who may just, decide on a different path. But like, how do you, I understand what you're saying, but how, I guess maybe the answer is to truly look at the feeling, and before you go off with your great wisdom, and I'm speaking to myself,
Hmm.
and
Same.
I guess to really look at that feeling and why you feel the need to, or share your wisdom with that person. And what did you gain from going down that path that you're going to try to deprive them of, is the other side of it. It's just, it's a kind of a, it's an interesting, very paradoxical path to try to
Yeah.
navigate. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the first indication that somebody is ready to receive and could make meaningful use of what it is that you might share is that they will ask you.
Yeah.
They will ask you your
True.
opinion, right? And if you are not in a moment where you're willing or able to sit with your own heavy charge, then you might consent them. So
Mm.
this is an aspiration for me. Not something that I regularly practice, but where I would feel very charged by how somebody is handling their life, and be that an intimate friend or somebody I'm interacting with, out in the world. And I might offer them the opportunity to consent to what it is that I'm about to share, which is, here is how I am different, right? So I might say, like, hey, I have some experience with this. Are you open to hearing about it?
Mm.
Right. So, I have such fluid relationships with my girlfriends that it almost feels stilted or weird, like, to
Yeah.
say something like that, but the real practice is in recognizing when I am activated in my body, and to know that whatever comes through my mouth to that person is most likely for my own soothing,
Mm.
then it's more likely that than it is in service of them, because we don't know. You don't know. I don't know that somebody doesn't need to have these
Yeah.
challenges, right? Like, who the hell am I to know? I couldn't know that for my most intimate human. I don't know that for my children, right? I really don't know what somebody's path is meant to be, marked by. And I'm also obviously a massive believer in the exposure to information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when you know what is possible, then and only then do you have an actual choice. So, how do we, like you said, it's a paradox. Like, how do we balance those things, right? Like, your friend doesn't know, that
Yeah.
I have an evidence based protocol to address depression, right? Like, maybe she doesn't know there's another option. And if she only knew, she would make a different choice, right? How do we balance that? I still think that we end up being exposed somehow to exactly what it is that we need to know magically, mysteriously.
Yeah.
And that could be through a friend who just blurts it out. Maybe it is. And if you do that, maybe you're meant to do that.
Right.
Who knows? But I just think the most self loving thing for us to do when we are interacting with people who are about to walk off what we think is a cliff, or making a choice that we've made before and caused so much pain,
Mm.
or they just seem to not get it and we get it, right? Like, whenever we are in that moment as individuals, it's an opportunity for us to stay with ourselves. And what I mean by that is to not get in someone else's lane, try to, clean up the landscape over there, when we can actually stay in our own and operate from that place.
Mm.
And that kind of self abandonment and self betrayal, and imagining that it's our responsibility or duty, or that it's out of love, or support or caring, that we are going to meddle in somebody else's space. It's actually a form of self violation. I know it sounds dramatic, but it's like I imagine, like, it's like I leave the post of my own heart, right? Like, I leave the fragments of me that are uncomfortable, right? That are struggling with a mess in there, and I go and I just try to fix it up over there, right? It's
Yeah.
like, you know, if my daughter comes home from school and she's had like this argument with a girlfriend, let's say, and she tells me all this horrible stuff that the kid said to her and what she did, and she stole this thing from her or whatever. And it's like, if I'm like, oh my God, and I get right on the phone and I'm bitching at the mom and I'm like, how dare your kid do this to my kid? My child is left unattended with no capacity to metabolize those
Mm.
emotions, because I'm busy trying to fix it with the other mom, blaming the other mom and trying to get the other kid punished, right?
Yeah.
So we do this to ourselves all the time, where we literally like leave our crying parts, alone. And
Yeah.
they're used to it, right? They're used to being alone. They're used to being ignored. They're used to being rejected and oppressed. And so it's not like it's unfamiliar. It's just at a certain point you recognize, like, whoa, I have choices here like I didn't have before. And I might want to just like try one of them
Yeah.
on, right? Just try a different way of responding to the same kind of feeling.
Yeah. I have two young boys, 9 and 12 now. And I've been following, your evolution as a parent, and it's obviously a huge priority for me, and part of, my motivation for coming into the homeostasis that I have and becoming the person that I have is, when I had kids, it helped me motivate me to get on the right path, for a lot of reasons. But you have a lot of fascinating philosophy and advice that ties into your work about parenting. And, like, obviously some of us were, have become aware of the programming that we got when we were kids, or lack thereof, and you can extrapolate programming into all kinds of, you know, dysfunction, abuse, what you name it, right? Now, on the flip side of that is a lot of those things have become the very catalyst for the people that we've become,
Right.
So you can't take that away. At the same time, as a parent, you obviously don't want to repeat what puts you through such darkness and caused you so much strife and pain for so many years, trying to figure
Right.
out what was maybe wrong with you. So how can we, I guess, you know, keep our kids from receiving programming that is going to, you know, give them a lot of trouble when they get past their teenage years and into life and in relationships? How can we, I guess, how can we role model and also keep them? Because I feel like half of parenting these days is like trying to mitigate bad habits, not necessarily bad behavior, but I mean, with they're surrounded by and what they're being taught. Um, the relationship with technology is just like it's just one. It seems to be one pitfall after the next, one trap after the next. So how do we be role models without kind of falling on into our own tyrant? Becoming
Right.
the tyrant that that you're going to instill that behavior, and it comes from your parents. It's such a tightrope to walk. So I'm
Yep.
wondering how where are you out on that right now, and what's your advice for us?
Mm. Yeah, I did a whole 3-day workshop on this subject that I really only felt called Victimless Mothering, that I really only felt even remotely ready to offer, 14 years into
Mm,
my mothering journey. And it's, been chiefly informed by all of the ways that I've done it wrong, right? Like all of the ways that I just like, oof, the shame inducing awareness of how I have imagined myself to be better, to have transcended, to have ended all of these cycles in my mother line, and to witness that I have just, put a spiritual cloak on all of the shit, that
mm,
I experienced as a kid, right? So how have I done that? Well, one of the major ways that I have done that is in offering a grid for conditional love to my children that is marked by the good and the bad tenets of healthy living, holistic
mm,
living, awakened living, right? So in, these communities, we identify all sorts of things, right? You and I were talking about the rejection, empowerment of the enemy, right? So, we got the EMFs, we got the, poisonous processed foods
mm,
and, associated agrochemicals. We have all of the brainwashing of Rockefeller education. We have all of the ways that you can participate in this like fiat currency debt-based system. We have all of these deceptions that you must awaken to, otherwise you're taking the bait. And all of that is bad,
mhm.
right? And especially when it comes to like the household, right? So like, the food and the tech and,
Yeah.
the products. I have two daughters, right? So the cosmetic products and whatever, there's bad and there's good, right? There's the underwire bra that's bad. And then there is the regular bra
Right.
that's good, especially if it's organic cotton. Okay. And then, when it comes to food, like I raised my kids, they never one time ever at a birthday party had like the cake or the pizza. Not
Wow.
one time. And I thought, well, I'm holding a strong boundary against, the aggressor,
Yeah.
right? Or whatever. And these poor, sad parents who just don't know any better or aren't strong enough to hold the line for their kids, right? Um, and what I, slowly developed an awareness of over the years is that my daughters would seem to um, recognize when they would make a choice that was in line with, again, what I agree with, right? So
Mm,
when they would merge with my reality, they would get love. And when they might make a choice, right? Like, what if they sneak a Snickers bar into the
right.
house and I find out, that they ate it, then they're going to lose love. I'm going to be upset. My heart's going to close. I mean, I've never, yelled at, I actually never punished my children because I read Alfie Kohn's book, Unconditional Parenting, in just the right time.
Mm.
But, there are other ways. And he
Yeah.
makes this point, you don't have to yell and scream and hit to make it clear to your children that they've lost
Right.
your love and affection and attention and connection. And so that kind of conditional offering is honestly no different
Yeah.
than be quiet, be good, eat all your food on your plate, behave, comply, all that stuff, be obedient, from the 1950s, right?
Right.
Like it's the same conditional love access. And it is predicated on everything we've been talking about so far, which is the intolerance of the sensations that come up inside of us as parents and the expectation that it's our children's job to resolve those sensations. I mean, it's really that simple, right? Like if I don't like, something that my child has done, whether it's like make a mess or, say a thing or, exhibit an energy or make a choice, and I choose to punish them for that or send them to their room or make a snarky comment or in some way make clear to them that I am displeased.
Yeah.
Is it really for them or is it really because that I can't otherwise regulate my own system? Right. And so that's why the greatest gift that we can give to our children, I think, is our own self-care, right? Like our own self-mastery, our own self-soothing, our own capacity to be with
Yeah.
the sensations inside our own body, to grow that spine and to develop the curiosity that only becomes available when you have enough nervous system healing to be in a moment of an inner storm, your inner storm. And I tell many stories, most of which are pretty humiliating, around like how I have biffed it on the mothering front. But I do tell one story of where I really, really succeeded and I really felt proud of myself. And, the abridged version is that it was in a moment where I invited feedback from, my daughters about like unprocessed stuff from the past that might still be bothering them. And I was offered a narrative by one of my daughters of, a version of reality, historical reality that was not very flattering to me, right? So that almost painted me as the villain and blamed me for, things that fell apart in our family, et cetera. Meanwhile, in my story, I'm like the heroine, right? Like I'm the courageous one who fixed everything in our dysfunctional ass family. And because I had, I've been preparing, for this. I didn't just like spontaneously ask this question. I recognize the opportunity, to not impose my reality. So again, the same thing we've been talking about on her unconsented, right? And to simply say, tell me more. That phrase is a very powerful tool in your, in your toolbox as a parent. When you don't know what to say, when you want to say the thing that you're going to have that like inner cringe around because you're going to know better that there is another way and that you're sounding a lot like your own parents, just with different, words, same tone. Tell me more is a ready phrase that can shift you into that curiosity, and you can even fake it till you make it, right? So you can just get more information, express curiosity. And if you can just imagine like back when you were a kid, right? Like what it is to experience that curiosity from a parent doesn't agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
That is sovereign love. That is the experience of being seen and heard and understood for who you are, not as an apparatus of stabilization for your parents' emotional immaturity. And I think that if we can do this work, that hierarchical, top down, power over, control and fear based impulse that lives in each one of us that we fight on the outside, through government and institutions, will begin to mature and evolve. And that's why I think so much of this is an inside job.
It is an inside job. And God, I can remember my parents were not very, let's say, inquisitive. like like I was telling you, I was an actor for 20 years, and my mom never. I remember the one time that she asked me about how I do what I do. One time, and it's so funny because I think she had an operation. I don't know if it was her wisdom, but she was on morphine,
Mm.
and she was at the house, and she was sitting there, and she was beaming like a little girl. She just had this look in her eye, and she asked me about like the craft of act, like how I act, and she listened to me, and it was like a 10-minute conversation that I'll never forget because she had never asked me anything like that before.
Wow.
Um, and she was really interested, and she listened. She probably doesn't remember any of it, but it was such a highlight for me. I'll never forget it. Just the
The same.
curiosity, wanting to
Yeah.
know. It felt
That's such
so
a
good.
beautiful story. Yes, because I can feel it, right? Like the impact of that simple shift in comportment, like
Yeah.
towards the child, and it's the proper orientation, right? Like that's why I'm a big believer in something called family constellation, which is like, a modality that is intended to reorganize all of these power dynamics that are out of place, right? And all of the ways that we end up parenting our parents
Mm.
and never really have an experience of our own child. Like I'm in my mid 40s and I'm like literally discovering like what my inner girl like enjoys.
Yeah.
Because she just didn't have room, right, to exist earlier in my life, right? Like dancing and singing and sewing and creating and playing. It's like, I can only hope that my children have some, that those parts of them have some nurturance, because
Yeah.
otherwise they're on the same, track that I am. And, the only other thing I would offer on this subject that's been really helpful to me is that like there's no statute of limitations on apology, right?
Yeah.
Like if you think about like your mom decades later offering a self-aware expression of ownership around her behavior, or to say, listen, like I was thinking about that thing and I'm really
Yeah.
sorry, like that would never not feel good,
Right.
right? It would never not be powerful. It doesn't matter how long it's been. So, my girls know. I mean, we traveled recently to Mexico. I think I apologized 4 times in 4 days, like sincerely,
Yeah.
seriously, for like ways that I was misfiring, and allowing my emotional reactivity to be cloaked in some sort of like, here's what's going on. I'm going to tell you,
Yeah.
what you don't know, the same thing again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a. I mean, that's the paradigm that we're taught and infused with. Obviously when you start parenting, it just starts. It just it's just there. It's that latent programming kicks in,
Hmm.
and then like everything else, you have to try to struggle with it when you're aware of it. Thankfully, I think more parents than ever are at least somewhat aware of the fact that their behaviors really resemble their parents.
I know, it's awkward.
It's funny. Bruce Lipton always tells a funny story about it. He's like the story about Tommy, who was just like his father and had no idea he was just like his father. Would get very upset when you're like, "Hey, Tommy, you're just like your dad." He'd be like, "What the hell are you talking about?" You know. And meanwhile, his dad is exactly like that. I was like, "That's yeah, it's happening all over the place."
Yeah.
Um, we've talked about so much already, but a very obviously hot topic right now, and there are elements of it that I'm not going to touch because I don't need the firestorm that comes with even questioning this. But I'm pretty aware of what's behind it. But in a more, I think, important and relevant manner, the modern gender caricature that we see, and this overt hostility women have been exerting on men in the guise of feminism, which is a movement half created by some of these same parties, we'll call them, for some reasons that really have nothing to do with empowering. truly empowering the feminine, and kind of the simmering rage that men have towards women, that's epitomized by this trope of toxic masculinity that we see, and
Mhm.
what is really going on. And 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 I know this is something that you're very actively involved in working on. What can we do as a society, and of course starts individually, to find more harmony and balance in that juxtaposition?
God, I'm so passionate about this topic. And, I started a podcast called Reclamation Radio myself, and in January, and came out the gates on this very subject. And I called it the trap of feminism. And as somebody who identified as a feminist, gosh, as long as I can remember, I used to, in medical school, feel like the entitlement of, birth control and elective cesarean section, and, all of these ways in which I imagined the goal was to win, right? The zero sum game against men, at least to secure my capacity to do what they can do bleeding, kind of a thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Having never had a role model for what an empowered woman through and by virtue of her feminine power would even look like. Of course, this emulation, this competition, and this sense of fear driven, pursuit of dominance
Mm-hmm.
was really all I think we had available. And now, thankfully, there is a zeitgeist. Those of us in the sort of, truther realms, if you will, know that any big movement is always socially engineered and funded, and that what appears to be organic and in service of justice is part of a Hegelian dialectic, right?
Yeah.
It's part of how we are pit against each other. And so, what I began to understand is that just like any other victim story, you know, feminism it appears to confer a sense of power, but what it really offers is the erotic caress of the enemy, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that sense of like, I hate you, and until I dominate you, I will not be okay,
Right.
right? So I think one of the big sort of reveals is that there is something very universal that women actually expect and want from men. And it is not for them to be cowering and apologizing. It's also, interestingly, probably not for them to be like feeling all the feels with us, right? And
Right.
in their, again, like new age sanctioned and supported, right? Like demonstrative emotionality. There is an archetype of the divine father. There is a sense of what a man's role is in the collective, but also in the dyad, of the man woman dyad, which is, it is the protector, it
Yeah.
is the clear vision, it is the one who is still. It is, this total containment of all that is wild and chaotic and disorganized. And that there is a complementary balance that is arrived at only when a man is in his full power and a woman is in hers. That it's not this neutralized, sort of split the bill 50-50,
Yeah.
kind of a energy of I am as worthy as you. It's actually like my power derives from this place and yours derives from this place. And when we come into the fullest expression of each of those, we offer each other something that wouldn't otherwise be available. And so the plot twist is that in order to, let's say, get what I want from a man, I have responsibilities. And what it is that I might consider offering are the very things that I have been told never to offer: trust, respect, admiration, appreciation, right? I've been told and trained that he better earn that, and he better, like live without it for a good long time
Right.
because he's in
To prove how
punishment
much
mode.
he deserves it.
Right,
Right.
exactly. Right. And so, what lives and rots at the core of that perspective is the fear that every woman has that a man can kill her with his bare hands. I believe this fear drives most women to comport themselves towards men in a micromanaging, controlling, shaming, scathing, diminishing, dismissive comportment.
Hmm.
And it's a perfect match for what many have identified as like men's greatest fear, which is not the same, right? It's that you will be shamed, that you'll be laughed at, that you'll be derided into oblivion, and that you will be starved from the energy of a
Hmm.
woman who regards you as powerful and useful, and worthy.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, this exchange requires an understanding of the dynamics of dominance and submission that is far more nuanced than anything our society has allowed us to appreciate. Right. That there is a way that a polarized hierarchy can actually serve both parties. And it's like a total twist on the
Hmm.
power over control based dominance that we've only ever known. Right. So that's why it feels like I would never do that. I would never submit to a man as a woman. That's giving my power away. What if that actually is how you secure the very safety that you imagine is only going to come through your self-defense? And so, a couple of years ago, I began a practice of, you know, um, not speaking ill of men, right? Like with my girlfriends, of endeavoring
Was
to,
it hard? Was it hard?
it still is.
Yeah.
It still is, because it's that commiseration connection. I mean, especially about like exes and,
Yeah.
like women, but even just sort of like the average guy, right? Like not getting that little hit of, I am safe, right? I'm safe now, from that kind of diminishing
Hmm.
speech. Even the way, that I speak about my ex partnerships, right? Like it's tempting, I think, as women to be like, oh, my toxic this, my toxic that,
Yeah.
right? Like, I've
Oh
had
yeah.
legendary love affairs, right? And I am grateful, to every man who has crossed my path, right? So how can I interact with men, including this interaction, and like leave them with a sense of being appreciated
Yeah.
and respected? How can I go out of my way when I feel that to express it rather than just allow it to, fall by the wayside? My teacher Omer Pani calls it making every man bigger. That's
Hmm.
actually my job, in the world, as a woman. And it's not simply an offering. It's an offering that is simultaneously to him and to me, right? Because
Yeah.
through that, I create a safer world for myself, because men are oriented around their own power. That is the safest place for me to live as a woman, is when a man and men are in their native dominance.
Hmm.
And I know that's a controversial perspective, but it's one that I've come to develop a lot of passion about, because it feels the same way
Yeah.
as waking up about medicine. It's like, oh my God, we had it totally inverted, and they had us wrapped around their finger. And we thought that, the way out was, you know,
God.
through the victim channel. And it's something totally different. And it's so much more beautiful. And it's also like humbling as hell, right? Like
Yeah.
it also brings you into that very vulnerable realm of like, I'm going to offer this to myself, and it may not work, it may work, and I am going to just enjoy,
Yeah.
this more fearless path.
I am of like mind, and I have had similar experiences, and I'm very much friends with most of my ex-girlfriends who I had significant relationships with, and I've like you have, I've cultivated those friendships because I care for those people. They were, that they were each integral to my life, and that part of my life, and what I shared with them was very, very special to me, and I always feel odd pursuing because it takes a bit of pursuit sometimes, after the falling out and all that, to remind someone that, just because you're no longer in a relationship with them doesn't mean you stop caring about them. But I noticed that it's not always a typical thing that men or women do. Probably even more rare for women, I think.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that you've come into such a state where you can be that, have that kind of evolved perspective
Mm.
about people in this life. I have a lot of respect and admiration for that. It made what you were saying. I got goosebumps about the way that it's been inverted. It's
Mhm.
so diabolical and incredible, and it just makes you wonder. How much thought goes into these Tavistock movements and these.
A lot.
I mean, because they're scary, with how devious and smart they are. The way that they subvert and make things completely the opposite. I mean, because what you're saying, when you say that, I just have this sense of male and female on this planet, and this long line of ancestry that we
Mhm.
have, and the nature of our relationship, and the nature of love between a man and a woman.
Yeah.
And you have a great sense of how it's supposed to work. And then you think about what they did with the movement,
Yeah.
and how they were able to kind of turn it on its head and shake it up, and make sure that everyone was, I mean, not everyone, but a lot of people were very confused moving forward into this new world.
Yeah.
And I'm like, my God, but yeah, I think that the truth is much closer to what you were saying, and the opposite, and the way it's supposed to be. And it's not a betrayal of self to allow a man to be where he's at. I mean, even saying this is, I start to the red flags start to go up my head. Like, I don't know if you want to say that. That's how conditioned we are.
Yeah, it
To
is.
say that men have dominance. It's like
Yeah.
a big no, especially these days with the trans movement and all that. But
Yeah.
wow, yeah, it's amazing what you're doing and how you're illuminating, people about your work. But I love it. It's great. So before you go, Kelly, I know I've held you over, and I so appreciate your time and your wisdom. And I knew I was going to learn so much from talking to you, and you have not disappointed for even a millisecond. So, but before you go, I got to take you a little far out with me. So I want to ask you. Um, I'm sure you've had incredible experiences of some supernatural, for lack of a better word. My dogs are going to make sure this question is fraught with barking. Um, whether it be in a ceremony or, some in meditation, what something that these are all words that we use to describe the interaction of humans with something that is not exactly in this dimension of perception that we have, right? So I was wondering, do you have like a remarkable experience that stands out, that really kind of like blew you away, that you would share, for some of my listeners who wait for the far out? Maybe you saw, I don't know, a spacecraft or anything of that nature, that you would want to share before you go.
Wow. I mean, I think there are two things that come to mind because I think the ceremony and the exploration of my inner world that has led me to contact with something that immediately and instantly dispossesses me of any of the concerns that brought me to the behavior,
Mm,
um, you know, are probably pretty universal. And I'm sure people listening who've had those kinds of transcendent experiences, it's like we all know what that
yeah.
feels like. However, I do think the more inbuilt experiences that are available to us through childbirth and through sex
Mm-hmm.
Are less appreciated for their capacity to bring you there and beyond, through the apparatus of your body.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is, in the experience of childbirth, I actually think that if we are unable to sufficiently reclaim this experience for women and for men, because there is a massive erotic disruption in that man-woman relationship that occurs when a woman has a medicalized birth.
Mm-hmm.
That's my perspective, and I have a podcast on that with one of my best friends, Ayla Cuenca. Nobody's really talking about this, and it's a
Yeah.
big issue, right? Because we talked about how the disruption of the man-woman dyad, but also the role of the man and the role of the woman in the collective. If you want to destabilize a population, you mess with that, right? You mess with that specifically. So I would say my childbirth experiences stand as the initiation to my inner divinity that I'm not sure I would have ever been able to cultivate otherwise. And the ways in which I have been able to access, what is sometimes called subspace, or this transcendent
Yeah.
dissolution of myself through sex and sexuality, including in like only somewhat sexualized, experiences of that kind of power dynamic that we've talked about. And the technology that BDSM offers, for example, when it comes to accessing the transcendent spaces of divinity within ourselves through our own bodies, in partnership, I think is one of the less celebrated. I'm trying to bring a spotlight, and not even as a seasoned practitioner, that's for sure,
Yeah.
but really as almost like an anthropologist, to this, of course, marginalized. It's literally in the DSM as like a perversion,
My
so of
God.
course it's been maligned, right? And, that's not to say that there aren't misapplications of this unconsented
Of course.
dominant and submission dynamic, but through that consensual experience, there are all sorts of transcendent playgrounds that become available. And it's all through your sensation and the play of sensation with power and with the focus of your attention,
Energy.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and your energy. So, yeah, I think keep it to the good old fashioned human body, and you got a lot
Oh,
to
it
work with.
can be so transcendent. It can be more powerful than anything you can drink. I mean, it's,
Exactly.
it's so underrated, and I'm glad you're bringing more attention to it. We'll have to speak again, Kelly. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, really.
You take care and have a great day. And I'm going to include links to all your websites and everything you have going on. And I'll let you know when this is going to come out and all that.
Amazing. Sounds good. So
Thank you.
good to talk to
You
you.
too. You take care. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Ciao.